Great. So our next session is a Learning Labs intervention again, where we are showcasing a case study from Brigade Group. The session will build appreciative inquiry into building innovation platforms for different industries and answer big picture questions when doing so. May I request to put up the intro slide for Nirupa from Brigade Group? As we do so, ma'am, may I please request you to please come on stage?
As well, that Brigade was one of the participants of our study. Very interesting platform, and how they're pushing thinking for the real estate industry itself. So Nirupa, huge pleasure to have you. We of course had detailed conversations with your team, but to hear it from you. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. So I'm here to talk to you about an initiative that Brigade Group took on. We launched Asia's first real estate tech-focused accelerator. I say Asia because when we started, I actually did a Google search to see if there were any other real estate accelerators in the world. And I actually couldn't find any, but I didn't want to make a big claim that we couldn't really back up. But there were one or two people doing some sort of incubation and acceleration in the real estate space, possibly one in Australia and maybe one in the US, I think. But in Asia, we hadn't seen anything because I remember Googling it and I couldn't find anything. So I'll be talking to you, I think, for the next 10 to 12 minutes on how the idea germinated and the usual why, what, when, where, challenges, learnings, and obviously the results. Yeah, okay. Just previous slide, please. Okay. So, next slide. Yeah, this one. So I guess most of you are from the tech space, so before we start, I'll just tell you a few fun facts about Brigade. I know real estate may not be the most fun industry to talk about, but there are a few fun facts about Brigade. So we've been 32 years in the business. Till date, we're across all verticals, so residential apartments, hotels, offices, malls, schools, and overall residential townships as well, so mini townships with all of these components as well. Till date, we've built about 60 million square feet, mostly in South India, and within South India, mostly in Bangalore, so we're very Bangalore focused. And we plan to reach about 100 million square feet within the next 3 to 4 years. So what we did in 30 years, assume what we did in 30 years, we plan to do in 5 to 6 years. And so we're on that journey. So 100 mil is what we want to hit in the next 4 years. We have our core values, like most companies, we have our core values called QC first, customer and quality first. And the F stands for fairness, I stands for innovation, RS, responsible socially, and T, trust. So what I'm talking to you today is mostly about the innovation facet of our core values. And we've created many firsts. I think since the company started, our first building was on Brigade Road called Brigade Towers, and that's why the company was called Brigade, and not the other way around. Our first project was on Brigade Road, and hence it was meant to be only a single building venture. And so my father just called it Brigade Investments or something like that. And eventually it's grown to be a large company with more than 200 projects across all our asset classes. So we also set up Bangalore's first serviced apartment brand. We also introduced the concept of mixed-use developments in the city. So we have had many firsts, but I won't get into the details of that. Two things we're very proud of is that in the last 8 years, we've been consistently ranked as one of the best places to work, definitely in the real estate industry, but across all sectors as well. So Economic Times conducts an annual study of the great places to work within India across all segments, and Brigade has been there in the top 100 for the last 8 years, which is not typical of a real estate development company. The second one is also we are consistently ranked amongst the top 10 developers in the country. Although we are primarily South India focused. Next slide, please. So I've been in the business for about 10 years. I joined about 10 years ago. And as a second generation entrepreneur, sometimes you wonder, okay, what is my role in this company and what do I need to do? And what I've understood is that sometimes what takes a company from point A to point B might necessarily be what takes it from point B to point C. So when I look at my role, I always look at it as something to, of course, safeguard the company's culture and core values, but to also take the organizational forward and exponentially grow, so to scale up, obviously. And the third part is look at the long-term vision and strategy for the company. So keeping that in mind, I asked myself 3 questions a few years ago. One is, where is this industry going and what is it going to look like 5 to 10 years from now? What are we doing to stay relevant in this industry? And the third is, how do you stay ahead of the curve? So the answer to all 3 questions pointed me towards technology. But I really didn't know how to go about it because I knew that people always talk about technology from exponential growth and the country was going through a startup wave. And what we were noticing was the following. So every week, being Brigade, we would get a startup saying, hey, we would like to come pitch to you. But I would do the first meeting and say, wow, interesting product. I think it would be great to try this product in the company. And then I would pass it on to the head of department. So say it was a sales-related product, I would send it to the head of sales. Say it was a HR-related product, I would send it to the head of HR. So, and likewise, whenever there was an interesting startup that would reach out to us, I would meet them, pass it on to the next level. But typically what happened is it would stop at that. It would stop there. Possibly 1 or 2 meetings would happen. So maybe I would meet them, then the next head of the department, relevant head of the department would meet them, and then nothing would happen. So I was like, okay, we're meeting at least 50 to 100 startups in a year, and nothing seems to be going forward. Why is that? And what we realized is that while the startup has a good idea, their business model needed a bit of tweaking in order for us to be able to implement it. Because being a, say, 32-year-old company, you have a lot of existing systems, software, we run on SAP, so integrating all these softwares is not an easy task. So the startups themselves needed to tweak their business model in order for us to be able to implement it. But there was nobody to champion that cause. Nobody was telling the startup, hey, you need to do this, this, and this. Or maybe somebody would tell them, but nobody would guide them to see if that would actually happen. So there were a lot of good ideas and startups reaching out to us, but we weren't able to take it to the next level. So, sorry, just go back for a second. Yeah, so the other thing is, what I realized is there was no few people, there was no 1 or 2 people with a focused attention on incorporating these startups into our existing business. So, I mean, everybody has their own job responsibilities and everybody is really busy, so it's really hard to sometimes find that focused attention that is required to really implement and adopt technology. And sometimes, staff or people are like, what's in it for me? Why should I spend all this extra time working with this startup and implementing this, this technology, and what do I get out of it? So there was a bit of that kind of attitude as well initially. So that's when I was wondering, how do we be a part of this startup wave before it's too late? This was about 2-3 years ago. Every time you open the papers, you see startups with great valuations, and it would kind of burn because real estate companies like ours with actual profit and tangible assets would be valued nothing, maybe a fraction of what these startups with no revenue, no profitability and no tangible asset would be valued. So we kept wondering, okay, how do we get part of, or how do we get included as part of this wave? Luckily for me, I was on a little bit of a break. I had gone on maternity leave, and I think sometimes when you take a step back and are not in the thick of things and you actually have time to think and get a fresh perspective, new ideas do crop up. So it was at a time when I was actually on break, and I would read the papers every day, see these new startups and the kind of valuations they were getting and the kind of new technologies that were being incorporated across industries. And that's when the idea came to say, okay, why restrict ourselves to just 1 or 2 ideas? Let's start an accelerator where we could work with multiple startups at the same time. All we had to do was find the startups that had already made headway into solving some of the problems that were plaguing the real estate industry and just work with them to scale them up. So that's how the idea came about. It originated sometime in Feb 2016, and I went through the process of actually studying the various business models. Do we do an incubator? Do we do an accelerator? Do we just look at 1 or 2 startups, invest in them? What is the business model? So I obviously spoke to a lot of people in the industry. A couple of people from Microsoft as well helped me out quite a bit. And I studied the accelerator model across the globe to understand what we needed to do. The accelerator versus incubator differentiation was another decision that had to be made. Because incubator comes at very early stage and the acceleration process, but you need less involvement. Whereas I would say for acceleration, you need quite a bit of involvement and handholding within a very short period of time. So post that, I did a feasibility study, I did a IRR projection, presented it to the board. The board had to approve it, had to give me a budget. So I got a 5-year budget for this initiative. And post that, I actually recruited the team, which I thought was the most important aspect. I think Hemant talked about the team being the most important aspect for any initiative, quite frankly. And then we worked out, the team and I worked out the program details, set out all the legal stuff and all the nitty-gritties of administration. And we actually launched it within just about 8 months of conceptualization. So from concept to launching our first program with the first batch ready to start, it took us about 8 months to do so. And this was way back in 2016. Yeah, next slide. So how was I able to sell it, and why is this really important? You know, why is having an accelerator so important? First is obviously real estate is very crucial. It's a large industry and very integral to the country's growth. They are projecting real estate to account for about 13% of the country's GDP in 2025. And generally, I'm sure all of you have at some point bought a home or dealt with developers at some point in time. Most projects are delayed and most projects run over budget. The numbers are actually given by some McKinsey report, and these are global figures, not just restricted to India. But there are projects, generally the time overrun is 20%, and some projects even do a cost run of over 80%. Construction industry per se is one of the industries that invests the lowest into technology. Less than 1% of our overall top line goes into technology, and I think this is true even when I look around the developers in this part of the world. That is more from an external point of view, but internally I would say, you know, the way I was able to sell it within the board is to say that there's a lot changing, there's a lot happening in the industries, in real estate from a technology perspective, and we need to keep our ear to the ground. You need to know what is happening, and as per the questions I'd asked, how do we stay relevant? Having an accelerator would give us the opportunity to keep our ear to the ground and know what kind of new technologies are coming up in the market. Like I said, also, I sold it as saying, you know, this is part of our core value. You know, we need to sort of be the leader in innovation, and got the buy-in from the board from that perspective as well. And lastly, of course, like I said, it's partly to do with the brand as well. If you want to be known to your customers as being an innovative company, you need to incorporate technology into the way you service them as well. Yeah. So the typical real estate, one more please. The typical real estate landscape is like this. I think most of you know, when we were talking about, when I was talking about creating this venture, you know, housing.com was doing really well. And then most people are used to 99 acres, Magic Bricks, very B2C kind of companies, very e-commerce focused. But that was not our focus, because we can list all our properties on these platforms, but there was no other major technology intervention. So we wanted to use more of a B2B focus. You know, what are the technologies we could use within our own business? So we looked sort of beneath the tip of the iceberg, and those are the areas we decided to focus on. Next slide, please. So we looked at, we said, you know, we want to focus on IoT, nanotechnology, clean tech and renewables, visual computing, logistics, and supply chain management. So basically, from a B2B perspective was our focus. And if you look at most of the B2C companies, they spend most of their money on marketing, and there's not much unit economics. I mean, I'm sure all of you must have been reading about Zomato and Uber and Oyo and the kind of losses that they're making. They're quite tremendous. So we wanted to focus on, you know, startups that could do that had a sustainable model. So we wanted to look at more the B2B side of things. And if you ask us what were the key differentiators to our accelerator, I would say is first very basic. It was very industry focused. If you looked at other accelerators that are there in the market, whether it's even in globally, Y Combinator, Techstars, they're not really industry focused. And people seemed to like the fact that we were very focused on real estate. For us, it made absolute sense, because why would I look at accelerating a biotech company? We don't have the domain expertise to do so. So we had a very simple focus on real estate, which really worked to our favor. We looked at it from what the startups want. So what do startups want from an accelerator? They want customers, they want to increase their revenues, and they want to raise funds. So we said startups want this, and we are going to focus on making sure we give them that. Second bit was, I guess the most important thing was, we took equity from each of the startups. So my philosophy was simple. I was saying the easy thing to do is give everything for free. The harder thing to do is to take equity from the startups, and which startup is going to give you equity. It was a way for us to stay on our toes. That was a way for us to ensure we are contributing significantly to these startups. Otherwise, nobody is going to part with any sort of equity unless they see tremendous value in what you're giving. So I thought that was a good self-evaluation mechanism by actually taking equity from the startups for them to enter the program. Most of the other accelerators, in fact, I think all of the other accelerators were giving money to startups to come to their program. They were saying, okay, here's 5 lakhs, 10 lakhs, 20 lakhs, whatever it is. You come into our program and we'll give you XYZ. I wanted to flip it. I wanted to flip it and say, we may or may not give you XYZ, but we want equity in order to accelerate you for the next 5 months or whatever it was. And sorry, go back please. So that was the differentiator, I would say, in our accelerator. The second part was the evaluation process. It was very unbiased. We had 2-3 levels of evaluation. So say 100 companies applied each batch, which was another surprise, because I didn't know there were like 100 real estate focused tech startups in the city. But every batch we've been getting more than 100 plus startups applying for our program. And first there's a screening process, then there's a 2-tier jury process where we get people from other companies, some Cisco, Intel, Microsoft, plus 1 or 2 people from Brigade, because obviously you need buy-in from these internal buy-in as well. So the process was fairly unbiased, and we would say we will give you a POC if you're ready, right? We didn't make any promises. We said Brigade will give you, will implement your product or solution once you're ready, because a lot of them were not ready to have implementable solutions immediately. We also said we will not fund you immediately, as I mentioned, but if you really scale up, if you really perform, we will then put additional funding, but will not be the lead investor. So they would have to get a lead investor from outside, and then we would be one of the additional investors. So the company would have to prove itself not just to us, but the general PE market as well. And yeah, so those were the main differentiators, and of course the team. I think having the right team is so crucial. For us, what I did was, for us, what I did was didn't go through the typical intrapreneurship way. I cheated a little. We actually hired people from outside, people who had worked on their own startups, who had failed, who had somewhat succeeded. So we got people who were good at marketing, who were good at technology, and who could actually really mentor these startups. Because like I said, the mentors or the team focused on these startups needed to know how to scale up these startups in a sustainable manner. Next, please. And these were some of our partners. This was another key differentiator to our accelerator. We tied up with people like Cisco for their city development platform. Our startups could use the CDP of Cisco. We tied up with Bosch for their Intel Maker Lab. Sorry, we tied up with Intel for the Intel Maker Lab. We are talking to Bosch and Schneider for their home automation solutions. We tied up with CBRE for their allied services in the real estate function. So all these companies would come help us evaluate and mentor the startups. Yeah. These were some of the things we looked at when we onboarded startups. Obviously the team. Is the team coachable or not? The product, the technology they were using, do they have any patentable technologies? What is the current market opportunity that they're operating in? Are they investable today? And if we accelerate them, will they be will they have future ability to be investable in the future as well? And go-to-market strategy and the typical things that you look at. The good thing is, like I said, we've received over 1,000 applications, spoken to more than 500 startups, and we've accepted only about 25 into our program so far. Each batch has about 5 startups, so that we are able to dedicate time to each of them. So very quickly, I think I'm running out of time, but I think this is the main slide. There were a lot of surprises along the way, and what were the learnings we found through the experience, I would say. One is obviously B2B startups. As I said, they're not as sexy as B2C startups. So a lot of PE funds prefer investing in B2C, but what we had to do was change the story, change the narrative. We had to talk about how B2B startups have a lot more unit economics. They're a lot less risky. So most of our startups had unit economics. They were profitable, and we worked towards ensuring that they're profitable from day one. So we pitched them as a less risky investment opportunity. The second one was obviously implementation of technology. It's very hard to implement technology, especially in a company where systems are already set in place. So how do you sort of incentivize people to implement technology? That I'm sure you've heard that quite a bit today. But what I did was, like I said, people would always say, hey, I'm busy with these 20 things. I don't have time for this. I'll meet the startup 2 weeks from now. Right? And in a 5-month program, 2 weeks is a lot of time. So what we did was we actually made innovation one of the KRAs in their annual appraisal form. So we said, maybe depending on the level of seniority, the more senior the person is, the higher the percentage for innovation and implementation of any new technology. It could be implementation of a technology, innovation of a new process, introduction of a new product. I think you showed us the intrapreneurship. I'm almost done.
Yeah, okay, I just thought we...
Yeah. So you had already showed the landscape for entrepreneurship. So we incentivized people because we said that's part of your performance appraisal. Your incentives and your bonuses would be dependent on that. And I think that has sort of given people a reason to focus more on technology and suggest new initiatives. Scalability, adoption of technology. The biggest issue is most people have a wonderful product. Like I've seen homes being 3D printed, but you can do it only for a 1-floor apartment. So I can 3D print a home, but as long as it's like 10 feet. But most real estate developers have, 70-meter homes, 70-meter high rises. So how do you sort of scale up that product to 3D print at a height? So that's the typical issue we found. Most people are able to give a solution, but for a limited bandwidth. So we said, okay, get the startups to focus on must-haves and not just nice-to-haves, but scalability is still an issue. Again, developers don't like putting money upfront, so the CapEx model was not doing very well. So we decided to move towards a more SaaS-based model, where a lot of the startups that we worked with gave subscription-based business models, and which were more acceptable for people to pay because you're not paying a heavy amount upfront.
Nirupa, can I just take a quick 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Just to connect, and I thought just for the audience sake, when we were looking at innovation and entrepreneuring, both from inside and of course outside with startups, before this, we've had a couple of conversations regarding that entrepreneurs need to also come with a founder's mentality. And organizations have chosen their different paths. Some have, of course, want to, like an SAP, looking internally as one of their programs for entrepreneurs. You're trying to build the ecosystem players with, working with startups. How does your internal and external objectives, sort of marry together? And is there people internally working with the startups as well? Because that's a key question that we asked a lot of organizations, those who are doing both. Yes.
Definitely people working with the startups, because if you don't have that, it's very hard to implement technology. So what we found tough was to have people dedicated and focused on this, because today we have maybe 40 projects going on at any given time. So for people to find time to just focus on one startup was very difficult. So we had an external team which we hired to focus on this. But from Brigade, like I said, they are part of the evaluation process, so they decide which startup gets into the program as well. And each startup has a mentor within the company. So if it's so for instance, we're working with a drone company. So I've put our head of business development to sort of mentor the drone company, because that drone can sort of take views of the entire landscape, give them feedback on the kind of terrain that there is and things like that. So each startup has a mentor from a particular function relevant to their technology. So last two, continue. Yeah. So the other thing is, what we've realized is, for some reason, we get technology in batches. Like last year, we had 30 companies in the home automation space apply. The year before that, we had like 30 companies in AR and VR applying. So and everybody says, there's no product like mine, you have to come and take a look at it. We are doing something completely different. So it's a matter of cutting through the noise and cutting through all the various business proposals and finding that one company in AR, or finding that one home automation solution that will actually make a difference to your business. Because, like I said, there's just too much of everything going on, and you have to find a way to cut through the noise. And so one way we do it is by having a technical team that's competent to see through the technology. And the second is, we ask our startups to have some patent, or to create something that's patentable in order to have a differentiating factor. And the last is, I would say, with startups, it's not just the business, right? Because once you get them on board, they have family issues, they have financial issues, they have legal issues, and there are investor issues that you really didn't know anything about before taking them into the program. So tackling that requires a team that will sort of go above and beyond their call of duty to help these startups resolve it, because their success is very much in line with ours. And again, that's why the equity is so important, because there's no sort of monetary exchange at any point in time, at least during the program. And we need to sort of, if we want the value of our equity to grow, the startups need to grow. So that was a big learning for us, that the business part is sometimes the easiest part of it. It's all the other things that are important to the success of the startup. Yeah, quickly. This is just the final results, what we've seen thus far. Like I said, 21 startups have graduated, 4 will graduate next month. We've raised about 40% of the 21 startups have raised additional funding. The industry average for an accelerator is just 10%. We've increased, on average, the revenues for all our startups by 111% during the 5-month period that we have accelerated them. Some are 0, some are 900%, but on average it's 111. And 60% of them, we've been able to give POCs at Brigade. So once they work with Brigade, then it's very easy for them, and we also take them to other developers. We sort of give them the opportunity or forum to speak with 100 other developers during the time that they're with us. And it's much easier for them to sell their solution. They say, hey, we've done this for Brigade, let's do it for you as well. So that has been the success of the initiative thus far. Like I said, so far so good. And the last, sorry, can you change please? The last bit is for future plans. My goal is to accelerate 100 such startups within the next 5 years. Not saying every startup will not be a big hit, but if we get a good percentage, that's enough. But the goal is to accelerate 100 startups, so we will have equity in 100 tech real estate startups, and I think that will be a pretty powerful tool to have. Thank you.
When we came across the Brigade story, we were really inspired, because as she said, for the real estate industry, which is typically a very traditional industry, to have taken such leaps, and for a woman leading the change, again, and somebody was just asking me, Kajal from Intuit, that did you do a gender sort of a demographic when you started looking at entrepreneuring and startups, etc. So we said for this study we didn't want to complicate it, and maybe for the next study we will. But it was really a pleasure to have spoken to Nirupa and the change that she's trying to lead for the industry. So any quick questions, because we'll move, before we move to the next session, any questions for Nirupa? Yes?
Question for Nirupa. Nirupa, the number of startups which you have, Brigade, the enterprises incubated is amazing, and the target looks, still we need 10x times if you can do it. But what is the composition of the people in the startups? Is it the age group of 22 to 30, 35? What's the kind of mix, demography? And that's important for me to try. And then where do they hail from? Tier 2, Tier 3 towns or Tier 1? Just to understand.
Demographics wise, most of them, I would say 70% of them are probably in their 20s. There are some people who have worked in large organizations like Accenture and other large MNCs and then started this. So we have a few, maybe 10 to 15% of them where the founders are in their 50s. There are some where it's a father-son duo, so one is in the 50s, one is in the 30s. But I think majority are in their in their 20s. Most of them are from Tier 1 cities. There are some, one or two that are runaway successes from Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities as well. We do kind of reach out to people in the Tier 2 cities as well. But, you know, ours is a residential program. We need them to be here. So obviously by that, most of the startups are from Bangalore. But then we have people from Calcutta, Pune, Delhi, one in the US, one was a US based, the drone company I was telling you was US based, but they have India, somebody representing them in India. So, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirupa. That was a very insightful session. May I now request Pooja to hand over a token of our appreciation for our third and